Hi, friends. We are again back to Soaring with Chaos. And the purpose of this series is to explore ways in which we can support each other. When there's so much chaos around us, when there's the risk of getting COVID or any such disease and the comorbidities that come with it, also the risk of job losses, and then coupled with all this is the divisiveness we see in society. There's divisiveness on many, many fronts all over the world, and definitely in the United States as well as in India, the two countries I kind of am close to. And that's why I called my friend Robert Taylor. Robert has been an inspiration for me. I think I met him almost 10 years ago. Is that right?
It
When you
was
came
something
in
like that, yes.
around 2009, when, or maybe 2011, when Robert was invited by my mentor, Dr. James Doty, at the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education. And at CCARE, Robert talked about his new book at the time, and about it inspired me to tell stories. So here you are listening to us, and we are again into the storytelling mode. So, Robert, tell us a little bit about it, the book that you're writing at the time, and what inspired you to inspire us to tell stories.
I think firstly, it's just wonderful to be with you, and you are one of the great lights of the world in my eyes, and I so value all that you give and offer
Well,
to
thank
so many
you.
of us. So thank you. I think I learned when I was a teenager growing up in South Africa, in the midst of apartheid in the 1970s, when things were really bleak, when school children were being killed in the streets because of their opposition to the racism of the system and everything that went with it. I learned from wise people that in listening to the stories of people who you were often taught to hate, or the system made you fear in some way, that once you started to listen to one another's stories, something profound happened. And it is as complicated as discovering that you are as human as I am, that I am as human as you are, and that we actually have this incredible need for each other. And that stories are the pathway, the bridge that break down the things that people who call themselves leaders at various moments in human history, whether they're religious leaders or political leaders, or even corporate leaders, people who try to instill fear, which often leads to hatred of another person or groups of people. So people then become anonymous. And so I learned not only the power of stories to get beyond all of that, but to discover this incredible richness about human life. And I also began at an early age to develop a fear meter that would let me identify very quickly the kind of code language that people use to instill fear. And I think I also learned about something that I didn't really know the name of at that point. It's called Ubuntu. It's this wonderful African philosophy that first started to be documented by people from the West in, somewhere in the mid-1800s. And it's very simple and therefore not very complicated, but some people try to make it complicated. It says, I am because you are. So in other words, it says, I can't really be my best self, my most wonderful self, unless you can be your most wonderful and best self. It's a way of reciprocity. And so I think I learned in those early years where the fear and hatreds were being stirred that led to physical violence and attacks and death, and demonizing of people, that there was a different way. And I think one of the lessons that I learned was that when we buy into the hatred, and start to hate somebody, we're on a very dangerous path, because we start firstly to lose our own humanity as we take away or think we're taking away the humanity of another person. You know, one of my favorite wisdom figures is a poet by the name of Mary Oliver. And there's a quote of hers that I often use as a mantra in my daily walking meditations. And she says, breathe it all in, love it all out. Breathe it all in, love it all out. And so, you know, it's not to deny that there is the hatred in the world. You can breathe it in and say, yes, it exists, but I'm going to exhale it in a way that sends it away from me, but with love. So it is a way of claiming some personal responsibility, especially during this time of fear about COVID, the horrible story that's going on economically, with people wondering how they're going to pay their rent and feed their children and their families. And then in the United States, all of the issues around race, and in various parts of the world, including the United States, the sort of scare that is going on around many different kinds of religions and painting them as being evil or bad. And it's a way to really kind of say, I can actually be centered and find some grounding here. And breathing it all in and loving it all out is just maybe one way of approaching that. And we will each find different ways to be centered, to be grounded, and not to be caught up in the fear mongering, and the desire to create hate. And, you know, Shankar, I'm reminded too of you know, Martin Luther King said some wise words a long time ago. I think it was in the late 50s or early 60s. He reminded us that no one is born hating. We're all born loving, to love, and that hatred has to actually be taught to us. And so, you know, I'm not saying that as eloquently as he did. He was a great and magnificent orator, but you get the gist of it. And I think it's a reminder that when people allow themselves to go towards hating, that is something that we are learning to do or choosing to do, which means that we have a choice to unlearn that or to not embrace it.
Yes, yes. In fact, I remember listening to you, and you talked about many role models and the stories from your childhood growing up in South Africa, and how at some point you decided to move forward. And I remember one of your role models very early on was Desmond Tutu. Is that correct?
Yes,
And could
he's
you tell us the
remained.
story of how you met him and what a difference it made in your life? Yeah, and you know how it transformed your life, and of course you're a part of the revolution that is going on.
You know, I feel enormously blessed to know him and to be in a relationship with him for more than 40 years.
Wow.
And you know, I was with him at the end of last year in November in Cape Town with him and his wife, Mama Leah, and we had a beautiful day together, celebrating our friendship and talking about the world. But when I first met him, I was a young, I'd actually just graduated from college. I'd been involved in the anti-apartheid movement. I had, you know, had a rough go of it. I was deciding whether to serve in the South African military, which enforced the system and committed violence against its own citizens, which is not what a military should be doing, and what scares me about what I'm seeing happening in the US right now, about the way in which the military is being manipulated or attempts are being made. And so there was no option to not serve. You could either serve or go to jail for not serving, or you could leave the country. I had no ability to leave the country, and I knew that I was not going to serve. And because I'd had major spinal surgeries as a teenager, I knew I would not be called upon to fight, but I would have some back office job. But in my mind, a back office job was the same thing as carrying a rifle. It was supporting an infrastructure and a war on the fellow citizens of the country. And so I went to see Tutu, and I was 21 years old and 22 years old, I guess. And I said to him, you know, I'm here to ask for your wisdom. I'm going to go to jail, and I don't know how I'm going to survive it. And he said to me, Robert, tell me who you are. And no one had ever asked me that story before.
Wow.
And I was kind of astounded. He didn't ask me what I did. Tell me who you are. And so I started to tell him the story of being in the hospital twice as a teenager for 6 weeks at a time, lying flat on my back. And, you know, visiting hours were limited, and to half an hour most days, and on the weekends, an extra hour in the day. And it was lonely. And I had a chaplain from the school I went to come and visit me, and he gave me a book about what was going on in South Africa, about the physical destruction of communities based on the fact that they might be multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural, because it didn't fit with the model of complete separation of the races. And it was an eye-opener to me. And I, at the time, had been attending the cathedral school in Cape Town, and the clergy and teaching staff there were all involved in the anti-apartheid movement. And they all told stories every day about what it was like to live under the iron fist of apartheid if you were a person of color. And so my eyes were being opened, and friendships across racial and cultural divides in the country started to emerge. That was how I was formed and shaped. It was by learning people's stories, by knowing one another as human beings who are beloved of a higher power. And so I told him about being in the hospital, about being scared, about getting involved in the anti-apartheid movement. And at one point, he started just laughing out loud. And I thought that I had said something very, very silly. And he looked at me, and he was lying flat on his back on a couch in his office. And, you know, here was I in the presence of this iconic hero of mine. And I'm kind of intimidated, thinking I'm this kind of helpless, clueless white kid. And he's lying flat on his back, listening to me, and he bursts out laughing. And he says to me, Robert, I knew that same fear and that same loneliness when I was a child. He told me that he had tuberculosis and he was in the hospital for long periods of time. And he told me that the author of the book that I had read, the book that transformed my life, was in fact his parish pastor.
Wow.
And he used to visit him in the hospital every single day or several times a week and tell him stories. And so there was this unexpected connection and bond by this simple invitation of him saying, Robert, please tell me who you are. And, you know, I've tried to practice that when I meet people for the first time. I try to say something like, please tell me who you are, because you never know where it's going to go. You never know what connection there's going to be. You never know what surprises there are going to be. And for me, I think that's one of the joys of life. And so at the end of our first one-on-one meeting that day, he said to me, Robert, you're not going to jail. he said, there will be a time when people like you need to go to jail. But he said, now is not that time. He said, go home, wait for me to call you, and I will get you out. And literally 8 days later, I was on a plane to New York City. I had never left Africa. But he had made that happen because he saw something. There was some connection. What I learned very, very quickly was that he had provided that assistance, that help to countless South Africans of every conceivable race, many of whom needed a time to have a sabbatical, to be refreshed, some who needed to go into exile, some who needed to avoid imprisonment, some who needed to go to be educated for a career and a path that they couldn't have in South Africa because of their race. And so he was this sort of almost this one person, but it wasn't one person. It was sort of like a South African version of and this is not a good, perfect comparison, but sort of an underground railroad of some kind of helping people to go and to be free, and many came back with taking on new leadership roles within the country. So a remarkable man whose life and the gift of whose friendship has blessed my life and continues to bless it.
Wow, this is such a beautiful story. I think I use other words, but I'm going to start using that line. Robert, who are you? It's so simple. By the way, did you know that there was an Indian saint probably 100 years ago by the name of Ramana Maharshi, and his meditation is just one line. Who are you? And then if you answer, I'm Shankar, or if you answer, I'm Robert Taylor, who is Robert? And then if you answer something else, I'm a human being, and who is a human being? Just keep on asking. It's a repeat question.
That's
And,
beautiful. I love that.
and that can be a meditation for several days, several
Yes.
months. Who am I? What am I
Yes.
doing here? Just who am I, really? So I'm so glad you mentioned that. And it's, this is where we realize that spirituality and the quest for self-awareness knows no boundaries. There are no religious boundaries here.
There are none. I think, Shankar, one of the things I've learned over the years, I became involved in the anti-apartheid movement primarily because, and apartheid, the South African government at the time tried to say it was the will of God. They tried to use the Hebrew scriptures in particular. They basically denied all of the gospel of Christ in terms of love and loving one's neighbor as oneself. All of that was replaced by hatred. And we are the new chosen people, and we are superior as the white race. I mean, it was just this whole combustible, hateful mix that was designed to destroy humanity and tear people apart. But what I learned was from my Christian mentors at the time was that there was another way. It was the way of love, and that when you love and when you are able to say, who are you? And when you connect with stories, and when you know that we have a profound need for each other, and that there is joy and delight and laughter in the presence of one another, life becomes very different. But what I rapidly realized over the succeeding years was that even though I was grounded and shaped by that tradition, that my life over the decades has been enriched and blessed and given profound new depth because of the many different spiritual traditions of friends, of people who I have worked with, of colleagues, and insights that have challenged and shaped and expanded my thinking and my spirit, and ultimately made the religion that grounds me richer in terms of how I experience it. So instead of seeing other religions as a threat, I see them as a gift, that the divine, the sacred, speaks with many voices, And each religion is one of those many voices. And we are so blessed when we start paying attention to those voices instead of being fearful of them.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You mentioned the sacred, the sanctity of it all. I always try to remind my friends that sacred and scared are anagrams of each other.
Yes, yes.
So if you are scared of something that I don't consider sacred, therein lies, I mean, in embracing the sanctity of it all, in
Yes,
embracing the beauty of it all is the sacred. Otherwise,
yes,
we can run scared chicken and see the enemy where there is none. I mean, how do you get rid of enemies? I think it was Abraham Lincoln. He said that, well, you can get rid of enemies by making them friends. There
that's
are
right.
none. So
That's right.
it is funny that this is coming back to us again and again. Um, what was life like when you came to the United States? And you've lived more than half your life in the United States now, isn't it?
I have, and 40 years of it. And
Wow.
I at first I was absolutely overwhelmed. I had never left Africa. And there I was arriving in New York City in December in cold weather, unlike anything I'd ever experienced. And I remember walking on my first day. I was taken on a walk by the person who was giving me shelter for the first few days in New York. And he said, let's go through Central Park. And it was teeming with people. And we walked down some of the big avenues towards Midtown. And I just was struck by the multitude of languages and the variety of people on the streets. And I was like a kid in a candy store. I thought, this is real. Tell me it's real. And so there was the sense of joy and of gladness at what I was seeing. And I think Shanka, going back to that story of that first meeting with Tutu and him just laughing out loud, I think one of the things that I've learned is that in this whole philosophy of Ubuntu, I am because you are. I can't be fully me unless you're fully you. It always comes to me with a reminder that laughter and joy and gladness and happiness are essential components of our life, and finding them with each other. And I think, in the midst of the current COVID and economic and racial crises that are gripping not just the United States, but many, many parts of the world, that for me to remind myself to be anchored with joy or gladness each day, and to find people to laugh with, is a very important antidote to the kind of fear.
Uh-huh.
In my time in the United States was how generous and welcoming so many Americans were and are. And that many of them told stories of their own family's humble origins in coming to the United States. And they had so many of them had a sense that as we were welcomed, so we welcome you, so we welcome others. And it was very, very powerful to me in those early years in the United States. And I feel sad over the last 3 or 4 years that we have been hearing a different message, that some people are not really welcome, because I don't believe that is what is at the core of how most American people actually feel.
Very true. In fact, I arrived in the United States on January 4th, 1987. Most
Yeah.
of us remember these kinds of dates because it was a big shift.
Yes.
And I arrived in Des Moines, Iowa, when it was snowing and
Uh-huh.
it was cold, just like you said. I'd
Yes.
never seen real snow, at least not in the home front. So the idea that there would be snow as soon as I step out of the house was alien to me, having lived in tropical India, southern India. And I remember being welcomed in Des Moines, Iowa, which was predominantly white with a
Yes.
few blacks. And there were practically, I think there were like 80 Indians in a population of 160,000. But the way people welcomed us every single day, and they would ask, like, where are you from and everything. I still remember when I first went for my haircut, the barber asked me, where are you from? I asked him, where are you from? And he said, oh, I drive 1 hour out of Des Moines and I come every day driving 1 hour. And he asked me, where am I from? I said, I'm from India. He said, that must be a really long drive. And I did not have the heart to break his, thinking, because, we all live in insular worlds. We don't
We do.
always, this is way before there was the internet and the Wikipedia and all those things. But the sweetness with which he said that, so he was welcoming me that I was coming, he must have imagined I came on horseback or something. But the way people embraced us.
Yeah.
I remember another time, I love these anecdotes. You taught me how to tell stories. I was on a Greyhound bus from Chicago to Des Moines, or Chicago to Iowa City, and somebody asked me, who was I? And I said, I'm Indian. And he said, are you full-blooded Indian? I said, yeah, I'm full-blooded Indian. And the guy next says, no, he means, are you a Native American? I said, what's that? Because I never heard that term. In India, we used to call it Red Indian. So
Yeah.
how the axis shifts. So yeah,
Uh,
I mean, all said and done, the United States has been a melting pot or a salad bowl, and people like you and me were equally welcomed. It really
y- y-
breaks my heart to see the
yeah.
divisiveness now.
Yeah.
And something in me gives the faith that this is a temporary phenomenon, that the United States is trying to find its own, what does it really stand for? Who is America? Who is the United States?
Yeah. I I hope and I believe that we will perhaps become, out of this whole experience, a people who are going to once again learn to discover in new ways. And I think, all of the protests and the power of the Black Lives Movement, which is so transformative in the US right now, and the way in which people are talking about race with a level of honesty that I've never really heard before, except in very small circles where people had been committed to that work, but it was not widespread in the way that I'm seeing now. And is there more to be done? Undoubtedly, there is more to be done. But I think that all of these things are coming together. I don't believe for a reason, but I think that they will together become a collective offering of helping us to reimagine who we are in a new way. Because I don't think we ever go back to an old way, but we grow and we learn. And it's Shankar, it's much the same for, our own personal journeys. I mean, I know that I've had times in my life of feeling failure or unexpected hardship that have brought me to my knees, and out of them, you work through that, you process it, you have trusted people to talk to, you might have a wisdom figure, a spiritual guide, you take on some new practices, and you emerge having learned and grown. And I think of in my first week in the United States, I was put together with a group of people my age in their early 20s, and they took me to a hamburger joint. And, it makes me laugh every time I think of it, because, it was a quintessentially American thing to do. And I was so touched by the invitation. It was wonderful. And I was excited to be sitting at this table with this interesting group of kids my age or young adults my age. And, you know, in South Africa, I started to eat my hamburger in the way I did in South Africa, you know, with a knife and fork.
That's so funny. Yeah, I remember trying that and it just didn't work. So, like always, there's always the challenge of uncertainty with respect to even the internet. So I'm sure Robert will be back soon. It's a little slow out here.
And they picked theirs up and they put mayo all over it and ketchup. And so I did the same. And in the first bite, because I'd never done this before, I had mayo all over my face and probably on my clothes. And they were just laughing. It was the funniest thing that they had ever seen. But they weren't laughing so much as at me as with me. And, you know, you can tell it still makes me chuckle to this day that, you know, in the simplest of experiences, we actually do learn from one another. They didn't know that there was another way to eat a hamburger. I didn't know there was another way to eat a hamburger. And it seems like a simple thing, but I think it's in those experiences with one another, the telling of stories, the eating of meals, you know, the preparing of a meal, the expectation of who's going to be sitting around your table, the conversations you might have. That's where life really happens and where joy is to be found, even in the midst of this very difficult, challenging time.
And I think every immigrant has some funny stories to tell. I remember asking my colleagues at Unisys, in those days it was Burroughs Corporation. I remember asking them, how come there's only one office of Northwestern Bell, which was one of the baby bells in Des Moines, Iowa, and there are hundreds of offices of Taco Bell? So, it looked like Northwestern Bell had just one big office, that's it. And Taco Bell was like a distributed telephone company.
But that's hysterical. I love that.
But again, you know, this is the beauty of it. I was quite direct. Even today, I am like that. But to be able to share what's going on and to be able to learn from it. Do you know any Spanish? Did you ever learn Espanol?
You know, I only know a few words, and it is on my list of things to do, to learn.
So this happened more recently when I was, kind of stranded in Mexico. I was there for 3 weeks. Then California went into shelter in place, and India went into an entire nationwide lockdown. So I couldn't go either place. So I just stayed. My host was generous enough to say, I can stay as long as I want to. And somebody was, you know, race and color is a big deal even everywhere. Not as much, the stereotypes are not as hard and fast in Mexico, but somebody had told me that if somebody asks you if you're a gringo, tell them, no, 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 I'm not a gringo, I'm a moreno, which is to do with the color, you know, the brown color. So I just didn't remember properly. I said, no, 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 I'm not a gringo, I'm a marrano. And marrano means like a dirty pig. So even now my friends in Mexico call me, oh, you are the marrano. But that's the beauty of it, to be able to laugh at oneself and to be able to grow from that, you know. So you've lived, from what I'm seeing, you lived almost 2/3 of your life in the United States.
Yes.
In what ways has that changed you? You know, there was that innocence till you left South Africa, and then you have most of your adult life has been in the United States, and again, you've seen so much. You've lived in many states. I remember from New York. You were also in California for a while, isn't it?
Washington and New York and California, so have been sort of primary places. Um, and, you know, most of my early work was, you know, I chose to go to a graduate school of theology in New York City that was multi-denominational. And so we had, you know, evangelical Christians from South Korea, and we had a Coptic deacon from Egypt, and we had someone who was, or two people who were Russian Orthodox from what was then the Soviet Union, and you know, so it went. It was, and I chose to go there intentionally because I had this sense that it would be more interesting studying philosophy and theology and spirituality to be doing it in the context of a group of people who came with many different approaches and backgrounds, even though they were all under this generic heading of Christian. And so I think that choice sort of really marked the trajectory of my life. And then when I was about to be ordained, I had accepted an offer of a position to go and work at a very affluent church in Manhattan. And the man who was my bishop said, "Robert, I know you've accepted this job, and most people being ordained would covet this position that you've got." And he said, "But I've got a friend who is the pastor of this church in Westchester County outside of New York City, and it's multicultural. It's a social justice place. They're involved in shaping the community and responding to issues." And he said, "Would you do me a favor and go and talk to him?" And, you know, this guy had been such an ally of mine, and how was I going to say no to that? To go and have a conversation with someone? So I said, "Of course I'll go." I thought, you know, I'll make him happy. So I go, and the man calls me the next day and he says, "I'd like to offer you a job to come and work here. And you're going to be involved in all of the social justice initiatives as well."
Wow.
And so I then withdrew from this so-called plum job to take the position that really spoke to my heart. And it was the, you know, another in a series of choices that helped me or helped create a trajectory for my life. And from there I went, and what I didn't know was the man who offered me the job left after 6 months, and I was the sole wet behind the ears, fresh out of seminary clergy person in this congregation, and it was a hard learning curve. But I went from there to a congregation where it was in a small urban city downtown, where we built a community development corporation. We built daycare for parents who otherwise couldn't afford quality daycare for their children. We developed partnerships with, at the time, IBM for having the latest computer equipment and programming for 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. We developed a huge HIV/AIDS program. We were near a veterans hospital, so most of the people we were dealing with were veterans. And a majority of them were people of color. We developed a community children's choir. We developed elder care services for the senior citizens to enable them to stay in their own apartments and live with dignity, and when they didn't need to go into some kind of institution. And at the same time, we rebuilt this congregation to be one of the most multi-ethnic, multicultural congregations in the country at the time. And it was just fascinating. And I learned in those years. I was in a town that had a Republican city council and mayor. Our state and federal officials were all Republicans. And what I learned in that community was the hard work that you do of building relationships with people and knowing that you might have different perspectives on certain ideas, but that we found common ground. We found ways to say, it is in the interest of this community to actually have this huge community children's choir. that it brings families together, it strengthens the community, that, you know, offering daycare of a certain quality is actually helpful to the economic resilience of the lives of people in the community. And, you know, all of the officials that I worked with were Republicans. When I left that particular position after 11 years, the man who had been our state representative and then our state senator had gone on to become the governor of New York, George Pataki. And we were in contact, and we had had a close working relationship. And I remember he wrote me a letter thanking me for my leadership. And he said, "Your congregation became the conscience of the city."
Wow.
And I was struck by those words, because we had at one point had a very, very significant disagreement about the location of a facility for people in our HIV/AIDS program. It was called Project Hope. And it was on the grounds of a convent of Episcopal nuns, an order that was declining, and an order which, very interestingly, did not have much fondness for me, because they knew I was a gay man and they were opposed to gay clergy. But if they needed a priest in an emergency, they knew they could call on me. And their business and their way of supporting themselves was to make communion wafers. And that business was not doing very well. And so they welcomed, because they knew it was part of the heart of their tradition, to work with the marginalized, with people who were outcasts. And they certainly understood that many people with HIV in that period of time were viewed that way. And so they rented us this facility, and it provided income to them that they needed. But the governor owned a home above the property and was not happy about having an HIV/AIDS program just beneath his home looking out over the Hudson River. And so, you know, we were in contact with some major news organizations, and we came to an understanding that the governor would finally support this and not try to stop the project. But it was a lot of butting of heads. And yet, you know, I think we all understood that give and take was part of what it means to be human. And you don't necessarily paint somebody as a bad person, because it's very hard to say, you know, you're a bad person. How do I then have a conversation with you?
Yeah.
And it's not you that's bad. It may be the thing that you're doing is what I think is bad. And that's a different conversation.
In fact,
so in answer to your question, Shankar, I think that what I learned and continue to learn, because we're all a work in progress, is that the richness of being in the US is the ability to work with so many different groups of people and to build coalitions. And that kind of work takes work. It doesn't just happen with a few tweets or a few posts on social media. It's as wonderful as I think social media is, and I use it as much as I can. And this is going to be on social media, which I'm glad about. And so I'm very thankful for it. But there's also that hard work of being in a room with people. I see all of that as a gift, and one that I think we need to learn how to reignite and recreate right now.
In fact, you brought up so many interesting and important things. I still remember Yorktown Heights was a part of Westchester County, which was the research arm, TJ Watson Research Center. I had many friends there, and thanks to IBM. And also the Westchester County was like the financial capital in many ways for New York City. And I think they called it the bedroom community for many people who worked in Manhattan and all that. And you know what you reminded me of? The divisiveness that we are going through. Um, for somebody who is, at the time, I remember the rhetoric that was painted by at least one of the political parties was that no, they tried to correlate homosexuality and and HIV.
Yes.
You know, gay and HIV were kind of made to look like one follows from the other. And
Yeah.
to be able to work with Republicans at the time must have taken a lot of patience and a lot of courage for you. And I really applaud you for that. And we are in similar times now when even things like don't ask, don't tell, or many of the policies that were, were have been around for 15, 20 years to welcome the LGBT community into the armed forces and into the workforces are now sort of getting on shaky grounds. Even
Yes, they
religion
are.
is becoming a divisive force and all
Yeah.
that. But I liked what you said that it is possible to work with opposing views. It is possible to build bridges. It is possible. What do you see happening? Is it possible? We cannot keep pointing fingers at others and say they are wrong because that's not helpful at all. So what else can we do to be able to build bridges? Just another thing. 2 days before George Floyd, passed on with all the violence that happened, I was talking to Lakiba Pittman, one of the leaders and a compassionate leader at CCAR from the African American community in the Bay Area. And she was afraid, she was concerned about the divisiveness. And then it happened 2 days after the interview. And I was like, oh my God. But the question is, how can, for example, Black leaders work with the current situation, with even the government sometimes taking sides? And so I know it's not easy. If it was easy, we would have done it by now. What do you suggest, or what should be the approach to take?
Well, firstly, Shankar, I don't think I can speak or suggest what Black leaders should be doing. I can only say that in my experience, I would say several things. One is try to ramp up your truth and hate meter. So when there are those who are trying to create fear and hate, and when untruths are being spoken, learn to trust your intuition and learn that the calling out that hatred and those untruths is an important work to do. But if you let that work just consume you, you will become embroiled only in anger. And the first victim of anger is always ourselves, because it kills the light and the love and the compassion inside of us, or injures it in a severe way. So pay attention to all of that. Call it out for what it is. But then seek to be with people who are telling a different truth and a different story. Build alliances. You may not be able to do that physically in the time of COVID, but you can do it online or through experiencing and being connected with other communities. I mean, part of, I think, the marvel of the Black Lives Matter movement is that, yes, there were whites involved, and people of many different religious traditions in the civil rights movement. But we have not, to my knowledge, seen anything quite like what we're seeing now, with so many people from varied backgrounds standing together with the Black Lives Matters movement. And so when you start to do that, you start to tell a different story. You start to actually tell more of this story of Ubuntu. I am because you are. I can't stand by and be silent if I'm a white person and you as a black person are scared that you are going to die in a chokehold as an innocent person. It doesn't even matter whether you're innocent or not. The question is, why should you have to live with the fear of dying in a chokehold? And so, to be able to say there is a different way to be human together. And yes, it is important to understand the history of race in this country, because if you don't understand it, you can't move beyond it. So the understanding is not to dwell there in the past, it is to inform the present. And to say we can actually together do something. And so this moment, as ugly as it is, also fills me with hope. So to have that truth and hate meter, fear meter, sharpened at work, choosing to be with people who are making a different choice about a compassionate way to live, about a way of, if we're talking about love and loving our neighbors, that also means having justice for all people. You can't love somebody and say you have no access to justice. And to build alliances, and to know that part of the gift of that is we start to discover new things about each other, because we're going to essentially be saying, tell me who you are.
Wow, that's true. That's true.
And
Please go ahead.
well, and I think to sort of bring it full circle, that, as that happens, that mantra that I began with in our conversation today, from Mary Oliver, the poet, breathe it all in, love it all out.
All out.
We can do that on not just an individual self-awareness, spiritual path, but on a human path of being human together. Breathe it all in, love it all out. And you could probably add another line to that about justice. And I don't have her eloquence, and I'm thinking that on the fly here. So I'm going to be spending the rest of today thinking about what that third line might be for that mantra.
Yeah, and in fact, you remind me of how people have come together in unprecedented ways. I remember your mentor, Desmond Tutu, and the person who co-founded CCAT, Stanford Center for Compassion. His Holiness the Dalai Lama got together and wrote a book together. And it's not just the book, to be able to bring the common wisdom of the teachings of the Buddha, which come from a variety of sources in India, in Nepal, and all those countries, and to bring it together with the Abrahamic traditions from from the the Judeo-Christian traditions, to be able to bring it all together and to talk about common humanity. Could you speak about that? How, there was a time when these were considered opposing forces or like incompatible, the desert religions, Abrahamic religions versus, the woo-woo on the east of the east or something like that. And I mean, it's really a miracle in our lifetime to be able to see these kinds of leaders get together, sit on the same podium, write stories together.
Well, and what you notice, because I've been in the presence of the two of them, and in fact, I've hosted them in a conversation before.
Yes,
and their affection for each other is very real. They love one another.
Yes, exactly. And I know you've been there witnessing the whole thing, along with my other friend, Brian Rush.
It's palpable, and they laugh together. They tease one another like kids delighting in each other. It's a beautiful thing to behold, because I think so many of us around the world, no matter what our tradition, have been taught that it is the only way.
True.
And And, I think that is dangerous talk. I think that those two men, by way of example, embody the fact that they are so secure in their own tradition, their own religious or spiritual tradition, that they are not threatened by the spiritual wisdom of other traditions. In fact, they welcome those insights. Now, that is a beautiful place to be a human being, to be so secure in who you are and what grounds you that you can actually say, I welcome your wisdom, your insight from your tradition, because it feeds my soul and my spirit and my mind. When I was in Seattle, I was a leader of a movement to end homelessness in that city. And we had some enormous successes, and then the situation years later became considerably worse, and it is what it is today. But out of that, we built coalitions with foundations and religious institutions of every kind, with community colleges and universities, with corporations, with social service agencies. And that's how we moved forward, because we brought unlikely people together around the same table. Now that requires work. It requires the art of inviting. And it also says, I'm going to set a table, and who is not sitting at this table, who should be sitting here. And so in the early days, I raised what was a fairly radical thought in the eyes of some people. We should actually have some homeless people who are homeless, who know what that's like, sitting around this table. We shouldn't be talking about the homeless. We should be in a conversation. So my point is, I think the setting of the table is important. And the table can always be expanded. I grew up in a home where we always invited what my mother referred to as waifs and strays, people who were alone at the holidays. And there was always space for unexpected visitors. And I think, it was one of the gifts of my parents, and I think particularly of my mother. And I don't know where she got that gift from. But I think I took it in as a child. And then I found in Seattle that as I was working with particularly the Sikh and the Muslim and Jewish and Christian communities in that city, that we formed an interfaith organization. We actually called it an interspiritual organization that brought together people of, initially it was just people of the three Judeo-Christian traditions, to actually find the commonality in our sacred texts and to use them as a way of empowering people in those three traditions to actually do collaborative work together. And of course, what happens when you're doing work together on a project is you start to listen to one another's stories. You start to know something about a tradition. You start to know that we share some basic core values, some basic common hopes, some basic shared desires for our children, for our communities, for the world. And it is such a life-giving way to live versus this be fearful of whoever, you name the fill in the blank. That is such an impoverished way to live. So yeah. I'm all for living this rich, lavish life. And by that, I'm not talking about things or money necessarily. I'm talking primarily about knowing one another, about celebrating one another, and about saying that together we can do infinitely more than we can do when we are in our own camps or silos or corners of the playing field. That is an impoverished way to live. We need to find a celebratory way to live together. I am because you are.
I so love what you're saying. And in fact, I'm going to ask a question that goes beyond a human, a human connection. Human connection is absolutely necessary. And this is interspecies. And I've been interested in a field called macrobiotics, which is quite different from what used to be antibiotics. And the reason I'm mentioning is that the old philosophy or traditional Western medicine has relied on getting rid of antibodies, getting rid of antigens, essentially things that disturb our homeostasis. We somehow shoot it out, antibiotics and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But we know that that doesn't really work long term. It is necessary. Sometimes it is absolutely necessary. If you don't want to get smallpox, then you inject a weaker version of that. Our immune system gets stronger, and then we don't get smallpox. And same thing with polio, and maybe even with corona, with COVID-19. But there is another philosophy, which is instead of trying to get rid of certain species, we learn to live with them, which is where the macrobiotics comes in. If we get rid of, right here in your body, there's for every cell of Robert V. Taylor, there are 10 cells of microbes. In other words, you're only 10% Robert and 90% microbes, all kinds of, bacteria, viruses, and other things are there. So there's no question of getting rid of 90% of you or 90% of Shankar.
I'm relieved to know that.
Yeah. So the real question is it possible for us to go beyond the fear that we have? There's this morbid fear. Oh my God, we have to protect ourselves. I'm not saying we should not wear masks. I'm saying yes, we should wear masks, and yes, we have to be careful, especially until we understand the nature of the beast. But the fear, the whole fear mongering around it has literally paralyzed millions and millions of people.
Yes.
More people are likely to die out of fear than because of the disease itself. That's my naive understanding of neuroscience and of macrobiotics and all that. What do you feel? Or what can we do to change our attitude?
I've not thought very much about macrobiotics, so I'm going to be open to learning more, to reading, to experiencing more. What I do know, and this has been, and I don't think it's a direct answer to your question, but it's sort of, I think, part of the framework of how my own life has evolved, is I know that with each passing year, I seem to have a more profound sense of connection with the world and the universe in which we function and exist. I find that I have a greater sense of awe. And I realize what a tiny, tiny piece of the universe we human beings really are. And our very existence is dependent upon the health of ecosystems of every possible kind. So I don't know that that answers your question, but it has become a profound awareness for me, and one that fills me with a sense of awe and gratitude.
Yes, in fact, yeah, I was not looking for a right answer. In fact, that has been puzzling me. I don't think there's a right answer yet, because we don't even know what is causing the disease and how it's manifesting. But yes, I am looking for an inclusive way of going forward rather than getting rid of things, especially because we know that as soon as we stopped, trampling nature, nature bounced back. Even the ozone layer has bounced back. So there's definite hope that we can stop trampling on nature, stop trampling on animals and birds and and fossil fuels and many, many things. So it's my hope that we come out of this. Some people even call it before COVID, BC, and
Yes.
after COVID, AC. So,
I
so
like that.
I like that.
So here's the thing though, Shankar. I think we collectively need to start a movement that says what is PC, not politically correct. What is post-COVID?
Post-COVID, yes.
What is it? What does it look like? Because we do not have anyone at a national level at this point talking about what the world's going to look like. People keep saying, oh, we want to get back to normal. Well, hello, sweethearts. There ain't no normal. It
Yes.
is going to be a new world. And so what is PC post-COVID going to look like? We are going to create that. And if we don't, we are going to let it fall into the hands of those who are the snake oil salespeople of hatred and division and tribalism. And so it is in our hands. And I'm filled with hope, as we both are, in terms of what the Black Lives Movement is offering on a macro scale as well as a micro scale. So how do we get that movement juiced up, enlivened, empowered?
Wow, no, you've raised something really, really important. I think you've given me my homework because
Maybe it's homework for all of us.
It is a homework for all of us. And Wisdom 2.0 conference is coming up, where they're going to talk about things, not only wisdom in the age of the internet, but also wisdom post-COVID. So I'm going to bring it up with people like Soaring and many others. From BC to PC, before COVID to post-COVID, what kind of a world do we want to inhabit, and how do we deliberately create it?
Yes.
Not just let it happen by accident. I don't believe in accidents. I believe in synchronicity, but definitely not accidents. We have to be deliberate. We have to participate. It's not like we're going to craft it, but we are in the co-creation process. So thank you for bringing that up. This is really
I look forward to us maybe having a further conversation about that as we go away and think about it and talk with others.
Yes, I'm going to ask that question to many more people. Besides, who are you? From BC, how do we go to PC, the post-COVID? What kind of a world do we want to live in? And how can we contribute that little drop in the ocean that will form that new world order? Remember George Bush used to talk about the new world order, one of the two Bushes. I think it was W. And now we really are talking about the new world order. So much is shifting.
Yes.
So maybe that's a great food for thought. And if anybody has any ideas, please write to me or to Robert, because this is really profound. We have work to do.
We have a lot of work to do. And, I think just the ability to start asking that question of what does a post-COVID world look like, and how do we participate in exactly that, co-creating it, because that's the way it's going to happen, takes us to a different place in this time of COVID. Instead of saying, oh my gosh, I'm isolated, I haven't been able to be with my best friends in person, or whatever it is, it's easy to go to, for a lot of people, it's easy to go to a place of negativity, of fear, of longing for what used to be. Oh, I remember when we used to gather and do X. Well, let's start imagining what we're going to be doing in the future, because it is going to be different. And boy, that'll take us out of our self-absorption when we're feeling under lockdown.
Yeah, it's like as you're talking about this, my mind is cranking out all kinds of things. It's like
I'm sure it is.
participatory co-creation. It is not
So,
going to just happen. It's PC is
so
post-COVID.
Shankar, for people who are maybe watching this who don't know you or don't know you very well, I will tell them that what I have observed in you since we first met is that you have one of the most active and sharpest minds around. So I can hear that mind of yours whirling away.
Well, I know that I'm always cranking something up, and I've learned to listen, which is probably the biggest thing that happened to me as I started interviewing people and mindful meditations. And in listening, I learned so much more. Before, I used to be like, I was like chattering all the time. And as I listen, there's so much I absorb and learn. So thank you. As much as the storytelling, listening to stories is even more important.
Well, what
And
happens, Shankar, is when you ask someone, tell me who you are, you got to be quiet so they can tell you.
otherwise it
We all
won't
have to
happen.
be. I don't mean just you. You
Yeah.
know, the last sort of thought that I have here is, I think so many of us have mourned the death of John Lewis, one of the
Yes.
really iconic American figures, a man of astounding courage, who understood that love and justice went hand in hand, and whose compassion was boundless. And he loved to talk about stirring up good trouble.
Yes.
And I've meditated on that phrase of his this week, and I expect do so even more in the weeks and months ahead. So I'm kind of thinking as a closing thought, at least for me today, as we think about what the PC post-COVID world looks like that we're going to each be a co-creator of, what kind of good trouble do we stir up together?
Thank you. Thank you. Very important. And it's so important that I'm going to slow down and stop and listen to each other. And to anybody listening, please say anything. Just we want to hear you. We don't
Yes.
have a clue as to what it'll look like in a concrete way, but there is this idealism, there is this desire, there is this wish to bring everybody together in an inclusive way. And how to make it realistic? Is it possible even? It's a possible creation. We're in the land of possibilities now.
We are.
So with that, again, thank you. It's actually getting to be even late evening here in India. I do travel quite a bit. My next stop is going to be Africa. I've never been to Africa. I
We must
wanted
talk.
to. Yes, yes. I'm from
Thank
here
you for this.
to Dubai, UAE, and maybe I'll ask you for references to go to visit South Africa, the land where you're born. I have friends in Sudan and in Kenya, so I'm so looking forward to it.
Good, good.
And I'm not waiting for
Well,
COVID to disappear because we never know when that'll happen. I'm planning to start my journey next month.
wow. Well, be of good courage and of good spirit, and be well.
With the right mask.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all, and stay tuned. Let's continue this dialogue about post-COVID.
Thank you. Talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon.
Bye.